Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Old World Chronicles. This is the Close Order lore series where I dive deep into the stories and histories of the Old World setting. Thank you as always for tuning in, and it would be really great if you could hit the like button and subscribe to the channel by way of a sacrifice to the greatest god in the Old World, the algorithm. Today we will be diving into the history of one of the most famous cities in the lands of men, Marienburg. This was requested by one of our subscribers, Mechanite. Thanks for the suggestion, and I hope I do it justice. If you've got ideas of your own for a Chronicles episode, don't hesitate to comment below or in the Discord, and I'll take these on board. Now, before we get started on the story of Marienburg, I wanted to touch on some specifics around timings, dates, and in particular the dramatic events of the end times. Now, in our first Chronicles episode, I discussed the differences between BIC and IC, i.e. before Imperial Calendar and after Imperial Calendar, and the nomenclature that I'd be using in this whole series. It's worth noting, however, for fans that are joining the new Old World game for the first time, that Games Workshop have gone back in time a little bit to a time before the old school Warhammer Fantasy Battles was set. The timeline in the new Old World game takes us up to about 2250 IC, which is just before the Great War against Chaos. Now, up until now in Old World Chronicles, that's not been a problem at all, as I've only focused on periods of history dating back way before this. However, we know that Marienburg has a great story to tell which extends beyond the period of the current Old World game. As such, we're going to be diving a little into the future from the perspective of someone living in the current Old World setting. Now, with that being said, I won't be going as far as the end times. Given the implications the end times had on the hobby and the game that we all love, I've decided that for now I'm going to just be avoiding the end time storyline completely. I'm sure people really like it, or some people really like it, but it does feel a bit grim to be ending any of these Old World Chronicles episodes with "and then the world blew up." I hope that's understandable for now, but do let me know if you've got strong feelings either way, as I'm happy to include end times if that's what people want to read about, but just let me know either way. In the meantime, please sit back, relax, and enjoy another Old World Chronicle. I'm going to start today's episode with a quote. A quote that will be familiar to anyone who has read about this incredible city. This quote is attributed to director Jan van der Kuipers of Marienburg. Quote, "The business of Marienburg is business." End quote. I quite like this quote. It feels like it very much sums up this no-nonsense city. A city which stands as arguably the Old World's largest port and trading city. It's a quote which gives a hint of the pride and a bit of arrogance which suffuses the current population. So assured are they in their superiority as a city. Marienburg today is an independent city, state and province, formerly part of the Empire before its succession in 2429 IC. Depending on if you're from Marienburg or another Empire city, the city sits within a province known as the Wasteland, or Westerland, respectively. The city is located on the northwest border of the Empire, close to Bretonnia. The city is built directly within the delta at the mouth of the River Reek, where it joins the Sea of Claws, which really emphasises the city's strategic importance for global trade. The fens and marshes here in the delta are not exactly the most hospitable places to live or construct a city, but the inhabitants of Marienburg are very proud of their wasteland. Marienburg is thought to be home to around 135,000 inhabitants, Now, for reference, this is a slightly larger size than the comparable cities such as Nuln or Talabheim and Averheim, but still much smaller than the massive metropolis that is Altdorf with its 1 million citizens. This population of Marienburg, though, is crammed into quite a small area, however, which was summed up nicely by a local trader. Quote, "Velvet and timber, ships and liquor, even someone's life. They say everything can be bought and sold in Marienburg. But there's one thing you can't buy here, not for all the tea in Ind, open land." End quote. As the city has been constructed within the Reek Delta, it's actually comprised of a series of islands connected by canals and bridges. On the mainland, on the banks of the Reich, the city is surrounded by the Vlodmur seed wall, constructed by the dwarves in the ancient times and repurposed by the city's currently mostly human inhabitants. The city is such a rabbit warren that you can very easily find yourself lost. It's best to keep a few coins on your person to pay for travel on the canal system to make sure you end up where you actually want to. An imperial diplomat from the empire was once heard to say, quote, "It isn't hard to find one's way around Marienburg, provided one is part fish." End quote. So in today's episode, we're going to go through a bit of a timeline of Marienburg from its founding through to the time of the Emperor Karl Franz. It's important to understand that even though for a lot of the city's human history it's been a part of the empire, it has always felt like a city that's a bit separate, a little bit off the map from the perspective of emperors and conquerors, which is really interesting given the wealth and power that flows from the city. As such, as we go through the timeline, there are some periods of time where those observant among you are really going to know that there's a lot of genuinely seismic events happening in the wider empire. But where these don't really have a huge impact on Marienburg itself, I'm going to skip over without mentioning them. There's another whole series of episodes that I could do as well about the governance and organisation of Marienburg, known as the Directorate, or episodes covering the various guilds, exchanges, emporiums and markets in the city. There's also so much detail out there about the various districts within the city and the myriad of inhabitants within Marienburg. Frankly, the city is totally and utterly corrupt. It's full of dodgy dealings, smuggling, backhanders and bribes. This is all actually quite fun, so if you're interested in hearing about it, let me know and I'll dive back in. There's a line from a lawyer at one of the city courts that gives a little bit of a flavour of the workings of the Directorate of Marienburg. Quote, "Amazing, isn't it? Rulers," referring here to the Directorate, "rulers of the most complex city in the world, and yet their meetings are models of efficiency and unity. It's almost as if they knew in advance what the decisions would be. But that would be dishonest, of course." End quote. Anyway, on with the history of Marienburg. The story of Marienburg actually begins not with the tribes of men, but with the elves of Ulfwan. The elves founded a fortress in the site of modern-day Marienburg around 4500 BIC, shortly before the first coming of chaos. This fortress stood for the best part of 3,000 years, before eventually being overrun and mostly razed to the ground by the dwarves during the War of the Beard. Now here, the ruins of the elven architecture would lie undisturbed for another 1500 years or so, before being inhabited once more. Around 20 BIC, the Teutone tribe of men, led by Marius the Fenwolf, fleeing persecution by the Teutogens, stumbled into the wastelands. Here, they encountered a race of cyclopses known as the Fimir. Now, it took a decade of war, but eventually Marius led the Teutones to victory against the Fimir in a climactic battle amongst the strange elven ruins at the mouth of the Reek. Marius decided he would found his kingdom of the Teutones at the site of this battle, directly on top of the elven ruins. He declared Marienburg, i.e. Marius' city, to be the capital. It appears from here in the histories that after the founding of Marienburg, the city entered a short period of relative stability. The city grew from a small fishing town to become a more distinct city, and the Teutonic people attempted, with varying degrees of success, to master the marshes of the wastelands around them. This peace and stability ended with the arrival of Emperor Sigismund II, known as Sigismund the Conqueror, in around 501 IC. Defeating Teutonic King Bram in battle, the city of Marienburg officially became a part of the empire, and the province surrounding the city changed from the wasteland to Westerland. Chronicler Ottokar, whose words we should take with a huge pinch of the finest Marienburg salt, given his clear reverence for Emperor Sigismund, wrote at the time, quote, "He neither razed their citadel nor reduced them to charcoal, but rather loved them as children, making their kind a baron and vassal of the empire, and naming the new province Westerland. And so he showed his love for all the children of Sigmar." End quote. After becoming a part of the empire, Marienburg's prosperity increased exponentially. The sea to the north of the city was stuffed with fish, and there were thick deposits of salt around the city. Both commodities were incredibly valuable throughout the imperial realm, and soon money flowed into Marienburg in great quantities. This new wealth drew jealous eyes from the north. Up until around 632 IC, the Norskans, located to the north of the Sea of Claws, simply traded with Marienburg, exchanging furs and amber for the luxuries of the imperial city. Now they decided that they actually would do better by taking the city's riches for themselves. Thus began a period of Norscan raids that would last for over 1,000 years, taking us right up to the late 1800s. Over this time, the city was sacked 4 times by the Norscans, including a period of around 2 years where the city fell almost completely under Norscan rule. There was even a period of around 5 years where the city was held by the Bretonnians, who had taken advantage of the instability to take control for themselves. Each time, however, Marienburg, her populace, and the empire did not take this lying down. In the case of the Norscan raids, the first formal imperial navy was founded, and during their occupation, some islands in the delta, particularly those on the fortress of Riker's Isle, refused to yield to their oppressors despite being completely cut off from aid. And in the case of the Bretonnians, they only stayed until the Grand Duke of Midland arrived to relieve the city. Regardless of the destruction visited upon it, the city was always rebuilt, and its vital location as a trading hub meant that many inhabitants became incredibly wealthy. Interestingly, this wealth wasn't entirely concentrated in the hands of the imperial nobility, as is the case in many other of the empire's cities. No, instead, the merchant middle classes of Marienburg benefited from their entrepreneurial spirit, and soon many came to rival the nobles for wealth and power, forming the guilds which make up a large part of the hierarchy of the city today. Now, don't be fooled. This might sound like a shining example of upward social mobility, and I guess it is after a fact, but one should never assume those entrepreneurs who are successful did it for any reason other than to enrich themselves. A local resident is described as saying, quote, "Sure, the guilds are a racket, but the guild masters, they came from ordinary folk, and they don't forget their own. They may be crooks, but they're our crooks." End quote. There was so much wealth being created in some cases that the merchants became creditors to the imperial nobility in the city when they fell on hard times, and even the Baron of Marienburg's own family needed financial assistance from those merchants. This led in 1604 IC to Baron van Buick reluctantly having to agree to give out seats in his advisory council to some of these entrepreneurs. This incredibly influential council, partly responsible for the day-to-day operation of the city and known as the Stadsraad, was previously the purview of the clergy and nobility only. Baron van Buick was quoted as saying, quote, "Admit commoners to governance, and you might as well give chaos the keys to the old world." End quote. In 2150 IC, the city of Marienburg enters what could only be described as its golden age. This is the time where the elves decide to return to the old world from Ulthuan. An initial arrival point for the elves was Marienburg. It was one of their ancient fortress cities after all, and again the city's location at the mouth of the Reek was a perfect stopping off point. Marienburg signed a treaty with the elves that somehow granted them exclusive trading rights with Lothern. This treaty was known as the Treaty of Amity and Commerce between Marienburg and Ulthuan. This ushered in, clearly, a level of wealth and prosperity excessive even for the people of Marienburg, and propelled the city into becoming the premier port city in the whole of the Old World. This golden age was unfortunately only to last for just over 150 years, but it is the current time period in which the new edition of Warhammer the Old World is set. Up until this point, beyond raiding by the Norscans and the arrival of the elves, actions in the wider empire and the wider Old World had sort of passed Marienburg by. Emperors had risen and fallen, greenskin invasions had been repelled, and political fires had flared up and been extinguished. All the while, the Marienburg merchant classes prospered. This changed, however, with the arrival of the forces of chaos into the Old World. As 2301 IC rolled around, the infamous Great War against Chaos began. Forces of the entire empire, united by Magnus the Pious, march out to Kislev to face down the legions of the Dark Gods. Marienburg was not exempt from this calling, and the last Baron of Westerland, Paulus van der Mast, heeded the call. Unfortunately, Paulus fell in battle in Kislev, and did not leave a clear heir to the province of Westerland. After the war against Chaos, the new Emperor Magnus was left in a challenging position. He was drowning in spurious claims to the province, and the significant amount of cash that came with it from all across the empire. Huge numbers of people who were apparently suddenly relatives of the Baron, feeling like they had legitimate claims, petitioned him to rule Westerland. Now, the Emperor Magnus also received a much more simple petition from a committee of merchants from Marienburg. This group, comprising the 10 very wealthiest merchant families, committed to Magnus that they would govern the city as a directorate, one which would rule the city in the interests of the empire, without all of the hereditary and familial complications of another baron. They committed to continue paying their taxes, continue to facilitate trade throughout the empire, and preserve the peace in Westerland. Keen to avoid another civil war which left the empire so vulnerable to the Chaos invasion, Magnus decided to side with the merchants. He decreed the cessation of the barony and appointed a council drawn from those wealthy merchants of Marienburg to run the city. Now, it's not clear if what was to follow was the original plan of that petition to Magnus, but it wasn't long after this point that the Directorate began the process of consolidating their power and paving the way for the city's succession from the Empire. I suspect if Magnus thought that this was going to be the likely outcome, he may well have just not agreed to that petition in the first place. But after the war against Chaos and drama of the establishment of the Directorate, things in Marienburg calmed down again for a few decades. This again ended abruptly after the actions of a pirate operating in and around Marienburg brought the ire of the elves down on the city. This pirate was known as the Red Pirate of Marienburg, and in 2344 IC, he somehow managed to navigate his fleet through the mists to the elves' homeland of Ulthuan. Being a pirate, he immediately went about sacking the elven port city and stealing many treasures. The elves, not known for their forgiving nature, responded by sailing their own fleet to Marienburg, slaughtering the pirate, his crew, taking back their treasures, and also burning down the city for good measure. Again, Marienburg had to start over. That being said, it does appear that trade with the elves did continue after this incident, as I suspect there were many powerful individuals on both sides of the ocean who benefited greatly from these arrangements, and who were keen for things to calm down. It appears the captain of the elven fleet, who carried out the burning of Marienburg, very quickly fell out of favour in the Ulthuan court, and the city itself took on greater responsibility for dealing with the pirate problem. So, over the next 40 years, merchant fleets and militia from Marienburg conducted an incredibly successful campaign against a number of pirate fleets operating in the Sea of Claws, thereby reducing the risk of another such diplomatic incident occurring again. The success of this pirate campaign, actually, culminating in 2378 IC, ended with the merchant houses and directorate of Marienburg being given the permanent right to arm and maintain a naval fleet and associated militia by the Empire. The Directorate sold this to the Empire as the most efficient means by which the Empire could deal with pirates in the Sea of Claws and avoid what would surely be a costly and devastating war with vengeful elves. This was the first overt step taken by the Directorate in the direction of independence from the Empire, but if those in power at Altdorf were aware of this risk, they did not let on. The Directorate were further empowered when they offered to take over the financing, maintenance and operation of the entire Imperial Second Fleet, something which the Emperor of the time, Leopold, could no longer afford to do whilst he was fighting several other wars elsewhere in the Empire. This meant the city of Marienburg, not the Empire, was in complete control of a significant fleet of warships, their crew, and the soldiers that looked after the province of Westerland. The Directorate's next action was to suggest to the Empire that it could better deal with the smuggling in the city with the power to manage Marienburg's tax system themselves. They appointed a new excise service in 2399 IC, and soon hundreds of smugglers were being captured across the city. Whether these individuals were actually guilty of smuggling or not is a matter for discussion, but this allowed the Directorate to show the Empire how much more efficient a system this was than the accountants in Altdorf doing it. Again, the Empire agreed and removed the Imperial Excise Service from Marienburg, leaving the city in complete control of its military, trade and finances. It wasn't long, a couple of decades, 30 years later, in 2429 IC, when the Directorate officially declared the succession of Westerland, to be known again as the Wasteland, from the Empire. Emperor Wilhelm III did not take this lightly and sent 3 imperial expeditions to the city to reclaim it. All 3 expeditions were defeated, the final battle being fought at Grutscher Marsch, where the entire imperial army was forced to surrender under the combined power of the Marienburg militia and a surprising contingent of elven mages from Ulthuan. Wilhelm III is forced to sign a treaty ratifying the independence of the city, and from that date on, Marienburg and the Wasteland is its own independent province. Fast forwarding to today, another 70 odd years, and we see the Emperor Karl Franz elected as Emperor of the Empire. Several delegations from the Directorate of Marienburg were reportedly observed in the courts of elector counts across the Empire during the process of selecting Karl Franz, and it appears that Karl Franz is likely to look more favourably upon the independence of Marienburg and the Wasteland than some of the other contenders for the throne, focusing his priorities elsewhere in the Empire. Accusations of bribery by the Directorate to secure the election of Karl Franz are, of course, strenuously denied. Regardless of its independence, Marienburg and the Empire do maintain a working relationship, which has even extended to the two joining forces to address greater threats together. The wealth of Marienburg relies greatly on there being an empire full of customers to sell wares from elven, dwarven and other traders across the globe too, in the same way that the Empire relies on the Old World's largest trading port to maintain the flow of goods and services into their land. In Marienburg, all the races of the world can mix and coexist and ensure everybody has what they need. A clerk from one of the banking businesses in Marienburg put this rather nicely. Quote, "Marienburg is an odd place. Where else can an elf walk up to a dwarf, ask for money, and, instead of being shown the door with a boot print on his backside, get a loan? Then again, knowing old Fugger, that same elf's grandson will still be paying off the debt." End quote. There we have it, folks. I hope you enjoyed this little journey into the history of this great city of men. I've just scratched the surface with this, but I hope you enjoyed that. I'll finish today's episode with a few words from another lawyer from Marienburg. Something that sums up, again very succinctly, this fascinating city. Quote, "The only two real crimes in Marienburg are being poor and getting caught." End quote.
Huge thanks to my two Grail Knight tier supporters, Morpheus Gaming and Mechanite. Thank you as well to everyone else who has supported the channel. Their name should be on the screen right now. If you enjoy what I do and want to support me, you too can become a member down below. There is access to special channels in the Discord, various other bits and pieces, including discounts on Saffron Slam tickets. More of those will be coming next year. Also, a huge help is subscribing, liking, leaving comments, all of that good stuff. If you want to, there is another video coming up over here and a subscription link over there if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.